Well, welcome. Welcome to the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3. This is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned for family gatherings, but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. In today's table topic, we're talking about the business of racism. Now, let's be clear for a second. We live in a world where racism, in air quotes, has stopped being a sin to be purged and has instead become a product to be sold. We've watched as multi-million dollar organizations have turned the pain of our history into a business model. They tell us the republic is on the verge of collapse, that there is a hater behind every bush, and that the only way to save ourselves is to keep their pockets lined with donor cash. But what happens when the demand for hate outstrips the supply? You start to manufacture it. As a Black conservative, I am tired of seeing our communities used as a backdrop for a victimhood economy that doesn't actually move the needle on our prosperity. It's a racket. It's the business of racism. And today, we're going to follow the money because there has been examples of racism being used as a business from so many years ago, decades ago. This is not something new. But if you are waking up to the newest story about the Southern Poverty Law Center, which we're getting ready to get into, then you're probably thinking, man, this is something that's new. I can't believe this is happening. But no, it's not new. It's very common. And as a Black conservative, we have seen this for a very, very long time. And that's not to say that only Black conservatives have seen it, but it's certainly been a topic that has been discussed in our circles. So let's start with the original scene of manipulation, straight to the doors of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and much more. We are going to crack open this discussion. This is absolutely a kitchen table topic in my house, and I'm so happy that you'll get to be a part of it. So, in order to understand why I am taking such a hard and direct stance towards this topic, we have to look back before my time for sure. If you follow my favorite historian and truth teller, Chad O. Jackson, he often points out that the civil rights movement wasn't just about feelings, but it was about optics. So let me talk about a specific situation that took place during Dr. King's reign. And let me give you the full details on this because I've mentioned it before, but I got to bring it up when we talk about the business of racism because this is a perfect example. So the goal of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Dr. King, when they went into a city, was to create a crisis-packed situation. They needed the world to see the fire hoses, the dogs. Why? Because this was a visual of unprovoked white on black violence. It was a currency needed to buy federal intervention and public sympathy. It was a strategy to create tension. But in 1961, Dr. King met his match in the name of Sheriff Laurie Pritchard. According to historical archives from the Stanford University King Institute, the Albany Movement resulted in over 1,200 arrests, yet it was widely considered Dr. King's greatest tactical defeat. Here's why. So, Sheriff Pritchard was a student of King. He actually read all of Dr. King's books. He realized that if he gave the protesters exactly what they asked for, nonviolence, the movement's business model would collapse. Pritchard told his officers, no violence, no dogs, no hoses. So when Dr. King and the protesters marched, Pritchard didn't beat them. He bowed his head in prayer with them. And then he quietly and politely arrested them because they were breaking the law. He did something even more brilliant. He knew that the SCLC relied on the jails being full to create a humanitarian crisis. So Pritchard made deals with surrounding counties within a 100-mile radius. He distributed the protesters so thin that the Albany jail never looked crowded. So think about that. the scene of violence that was necessary to trigger the media and the White House never happened. So, as noted in Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch, Pritchard even arranged for a mystery benefactor to pay Dr. King's bail so King couldn't stay in jail and become a martyr. But King wanted to stay. He wanted to keep the pressure on him, but Pritchard essentially evicted him from the jail, forced him out of the jail. Chattel Jackson's summary of this is vital because it shows that when the theater of the movement was denied its climax, the movement lost its momentum. And in Albany, this is Albany, Georgia, the SCLC learned that without a villain playing the part of the vicious racists, the cameras go home. And guess what else happens? The donations dry up. This is a historical blueprint for what we see today. You see, the business of racism requires a monster. If the monster doesn't show up like Sheriff Pritchard proved, you can then neutralize the entire movement just by being civil. It's important that the goal wasn't just integration, particularly in that moment. It was to create a spectacle of struggle. And I know that's a tough pill to swallow, and I came in hot. But to realize that even the legends were subject to the laws of PR and optics, we have to be able to look at history through the lens of strategy and not just emotion. If Sheriff Pritchard could stop a movement by simply refusing to be the hater the script required, what does that say about the hate that's being sold to us in 2026? It says that if it happened before, it can certainly happen again. So to understand why the Southern Poverty Law Center is in hot water today, you have to understand how it started. You have to understand that this is not something new. Because back in the 70s and 80s, the Southern Poverty Law Center was doing some decent work. They used civil litigation to bankrupt the United Klans of America after the 1981 lynching of Michael Donald. That was a real lynching, a real act of racism. But this was justice that came correctly. But somewhere along the line, the mission shifted from litigation to marketing. Because by the late 80s, even their own staff was sounding the alarm. According to the 1994 investigation by the Montgomery Advertiser, the SPLC staff described the environment as a factory for fundraising. Now, this was in 1994. Their co-founder, Morris Deeds, was eventually fired in 2019 amid allegations of workplace racial discrimination and sexual harassment. As far back as 2017, the Washington Free Press and the Daily Caller reported that the Southern Poverty Law Center, an organization supposedly focused on domestic poverty and civil rights, had transferred millions and millions of dollars to offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Why does a nonprofit in Montgomery, Alabama, need nearly $100 million in the Caymans? It's about the accumulation of wealth, not the distribution of justice. But let's get into the present day. We're talking about a federal indictment that was filed on April 21st of 2026. The DOJ is charging the SPLC with 11 counts, including wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The acting Attorney General Todd Blanche alleged that between 2014 and 2023, the SPLC funneled over $3 million to just 8 individuals, including members of the KKK and the Iron Nations. Specifically, the indictment claims that they paid roughly $270,000 to a leader involved in planning the 2017 Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. You remember the rally where Trump said there was good people on both sides? Yeah, that rally. The rally that was on August 11th through the 12th in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was marketed as the protests against removing the Robert E. Lee statue, but it actually was a coordinated show of force by white nationalist groups. Yep. According to the 2017 ADL report, organizers use encrypted apps to mobilize neo Nazi factions nationwide. The event turned deadly when James Alex Fields Jr. rammed his car into a crowd, killing Heather Heyer and injuring 35 others. Fields was later sentenced to life in prison for 29 counts of 29 federal hate crime counts. Organizers intentionally planned for violence to drive digital engagement and donations. It was a calculated scene designed to turn racial conflict into a high-profile fundraising engine. And the Southern Poverty Law Center wasn't just monitoring the hate. The government alleges that they were helping finance the organizers. This creates the very chaos that they then use to scare you into hitting the donate button. And while they are cutting checks to extremists, they were also cutting their own people loose. Because in June of 2024, the SPLC laid off over 60 employees. Their own union, the SPLC union, called it malicious violence against their staff, noting that the leadership chose to gut the Montgomery office while sitting on an endowment that the IRS filing shows reached over $700 million in net assets by 2023. They've moved away from the rural South and into the high rises of D.C. and corporate boardrooms, all while branding anyone who disagrees with them, including mainstream Christian organizations and parental right groups, as hate groups. So now we're the hate groups, while they are funding the actual hate groups. It's an overreach economy designed to keep the Republic, us, on edge. And this is why we have to be smarter than the media cycles. When we talk about kitchen table topics that are banned from family gatherings on this show but are necessary for a strong republic, this is at the top of the list. We cannot have a strong republic if we are being manipulated into hating one another, particularly by organizations that profit from the friction. When race is a business, healing is a budget cut. And I don't know about you, but I'm done with being the inventory for a business model. So when we come back, we'll look into more of these manufactured accounts, closing the show with the truth about racism in America. You're listening to The Janelle King Show right here on Extra 106.3. We're just getting started. Don't leave the table.
The left is siding with illegals, attacking ICE, and fighting to let non-citizens vote. Republican Kelvin King is a graduate of the Air Force Academy, Air Force veteran, and conservative businessman. As Georgia's Secretary of State, Kelvin will put Americans first, root out corruption, clean up voter rolls, and restore confidence in our elections. The other candidates had their chance and failed. Republican Kelvin King for Secretary of State. Leadership Georgia voters can trust.
Welcome back to the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3, and this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings, but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. And today's table topic is just that. We're talking about the business of racism. And before the break, we went into the history of how the business of racism has operated for decades. We looked at the Albany Movement of 1961, where Sheriff Lori Pritchard outmaneuvered the SCLC by refusing to provide a scene of violence the media required, proving that without a villain, the cameras go home. We discussed the staggering allegations against the SPLC that's been in the news pretty much almost every day now. An organization that's sitting on a $700 million endowment allegedly funneled $3 million of those dollars to the very extremists they claim to fight, including paying a leader involved in the formation of the 2017 Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, where someone lost their life. So if you're just joining me for the first time, the message is simple. When the demand for hate outstrips the supply, these organizations start manufacturing it. They need a monster to keep the donations flowing. And if they can't find one, they will fund one. But the SPLC isn't the only player in this game. To really equip you to see the strings that are being pulled, we have to look at other times our emotions were played like a fiddle. And in this segment of the show, we're going to pull back the curtain on the Hall of Mirrors. We've established that for some, racism is a business. But for a business to thrive, it needs content, it needs a product. If the reality of America, a country that has made more progress on race than almost any other in history, doesn't provide enough daily horror stories, some may feel that they need to script them. And when we manufacture hate, we don't just lie to the public, we exhaust the empathy reserves of the public. We cry wolf so often that when real injustices happen, people are just too tired to care. So let's look at the receipts, starting with an old lie that some of you may remember, but many of the young progressives of today were just too young to even know about it. So we have to look back at the 1980s and 90s to see the godfather of the business of racism. You have to look at the individuals who pioneered the industry. Because before there was social media, there was viral tweets, there was a man in a tracksuit and a bullhorn who understood the scene, in air quotes, better than anyone else. And I'm talking about Al Sharpton, or what some people call Reverend Al Sharpton. Now look, people today know him as an MSNBC host or the guy who gets invited to the White House, but in 1987, Sharpton was looking for a break. And he found it in a 15-year-old girl named Tawana Broadley. This story isn't just a family gathering secret. It is a definitive case study in how to manufacture a racial explosion out of thin air. And it started in Wappingers Fall, New York, November 1987. Tawana Broadley was found in a plastic trash bag covered in feces with racial slurs written on her body in charcoal. She claimed that she had been kidnapped and raped for over 4 days by 6 white men. And she didn't just stop at white men. She claimed that they were police officers, a local prosecutor. The imagery was horrific. It tapped into the deep-seated, legitimate fear in the Black community at that time. It was a ready-made crisis. And Sharpton swooped in with lawyer C. Vernon Mason and Alton Maddox. They demanded an uprising. And according to the New York Times archives from 1987 to 1988, Sharpton and his team held press conferences almost daily, accusing local officials of a massive cover-up. They specifically targeted a man named Stephen Pagones, a local assistant district attorney. Without a single shred of physical evidence, Sharpton stood in front of cameras and called Pagones a racist kidnapper and a rapist. He told the world that the justice system in New York was essentially the local branch of the KKK. And for several months, this case tore New York apart. There were marches, there were protests, and national headlines fueled the business of racism. But then the grand jury started looking at the data. And friends, the data never lies. In October 1988, a 170-page grand jury report concluded that the entire story was fabrication. Yes, the entire story was a lie. The medical examiners found no evidence of sexual assault. The feces on her body was discovered to be from the family dog. The charcoal writing that was smudge marks were found on her own hands. But the most damning part according to the New York Times investigation, is that witnesses and evidence proved that Broadly hadn't been kidnapped at all. She had been hiding in a crawl space in an apartment where her family used to live. And why did she do this? Because she had stayed out late and she was terrified of being disciplined by her stepfather, Ralph King, a man who, according to court records, had previously served time for killing his first wife. She created a racial scene to escape a domestic situation. So now that you know all that, you would think that after a grand jury exposed that this was all a hoax, that Sharpton would apologize, right? Wrong. In the business of racism, an apology is a bankruptcy filing. So Sharpton never backed down. He continued to go, even after he was sued for defamation by Stephen Pagones in order to pay $65,000, which his supporters eventually paid over the years. Sharpton used the notoriety that launched his national career. He used a lie to raise himself up. He learned that the truth is secondary to the momentum. He didn't care that he destroyed Stephen Pagones' reputation. He didn't care that he made it harder for actual victims of sexual assault to be believed. He only cared about his National Action Network. He cared about having a seat at the proverbial table. This was the blueprint. Use a vulnerable person, wrap them in a narrative of systemic hate, and ignore the evidence, and attack anyone who asks questions. And Sharpton proved in 1987 that if you yell racism loud enough, you don't need a witness. All you need is a microphone. And that, my friends, is how a strong republic gets weakened from inside. We trade the truth for a scene, and we wonder why the wounds never heal. So if Tawana Broadly was the 1.0 version of manufactured hate, Jussie Smollett was the high-definition prime time sequel. Because in January of 2019, the country was a powder keg. We were in the middle of a heated political season, and the media was desperate for a story that proved their narrative that America, specifically Trump's America, was a dangerous, backward wasteland for Blacks and the LGBTQ community. So enter Jussie Smollett, an actor on a hit show at the time, Empire, who decided he didn't just want to play a character on the screen, he wanted to play a martyr in real life. So on a freezing night in Chicago, we're talking about 20 degrees below zero, Jussie claimed that he went out at 2 a.m. in the morning to go get a Subway sandwich. At 2 a.m., he's going to get something to eat in freezing cold weather. And he told police that two men wearing a ski mask jumped him, shouted racial and homophobic slurs, threw bleach on him, and this is the part that was designated to stop the heart of every Black person in America. He claimed that they put a noose around his neck and that they yelled, "This is MAGA country." Let's think about this for a second. We're in Chicago, right? A city that voted nearly 84% for Hillary Clinton. At 2 a.m. in a polar vortex, he wanted us to believe that Trump supporters were scouring and roaming the streets of downtown Chicago with bleach and rope in tow, waiting on a D-level celebrity to walk by. Within 24 hours, every major politician, from Kamala Harris to Joe Biden, tweeted that this was a modern-day lynching. The media didn't ask for the police report. They didn't ask for a camera. They bought the script because the script was profitable. They all saw how they could eat off of this random story. But the Chicago PD didn't follow the script. They followed the cameras. And after reviewing hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, They didn't find two white guys in a MAGA hat. Instead, they found two black men who just happened to be extras on the set of the show Empire. And according to the Chicago Police Department's final investigation and the 2021 jury conviction, Jussie didn't just know these men, he paid them. He cut a check for $3,500 to stage the attack. He even did a dry run with them the days before, showing them where the cameras were and telling them when to shout the slurs. He bought the rope, he bought the bleach, and he orchestrated the entire scene. This is the part that really makes my blood boil, particularly as a Black woman. That they didn't just lie. He weaponized some of the most painful symbols in our history, the noose. And he still had the noose around his neck when the police came, which also was a sounding alarm for our community. I mean, you would rip that thing off your neck immediately. But no, he had to sit there with it on to create the moment. Smollett was reportedly unhappy with his salary on Empire. He thought that becoming the face of resistance and a victim of Trump's America, that he could negotiate a bigger check or a higher profile. But guess what? The damage to the Republic was already done. Jussie Smollett didn't want justice. He wanted a scene that would sell, that would route up your emotions. And in 2021, a jury of his peers told him exactly what his script was worth: 5 counts of felony disorderly conduct. Both of these cases ended without anyone being harmed. But what if I told you that there was another case that was riddled with manufacturing and lies, but unfortunately, a life was taken? Well, now we're stepping into territory that is still a little painful for many. But it is perhaps the most significant example of how the business of racism can take a human tragedy and reshape it into a narrative for national consumption. I'm talking about the 2012 shooting of Trayvon Martin. So before the hashtags, before the global marches, there was a script written by the media. We were told that a child, an innocent boy in a hoodie, walking home with Skittles, who was hunted down and executed by a white vigilante. But when the doors of the courtroom opened in the state of Florida versus George Zimmerman, the data started to dismantle the drama. So let's talk about the first manufacturing tool, the visual. For months, every news outlet in the country ran a photo of Trayvon Martin. And you remember it. If you were there around this time, we all remember that picture. The one where he looks young and he's slightly smiling, almost like a little middle schooler. But according to evidence presented during the 2013 trial, the media was almost exclusively using a photo of Trayvon Martin when he was 12 years old. But at the time of the incident, Trayvon was 17. He stood over 6 feet tall. He was not a child. He was a young man. But why does this matter? Because the business of racism needed a haunted child narrative to sell the outrage. And by using 5-year-old photos, the media ensured that the public was emotionally primed for a specific outcome before a single witness was called. They even initially labeled George Zimmerman as white. And this was to fit this historical script of racial lynching despite him being Hispanic. Then came the forensics. So the narrative we were sold was that Zimmerman chased Trayvon down and shot him in cold blood. But the physical evidence told much more, a much more complex story, a story of a physical altercation that turned deadly. And as noted in the Florida Department of Law Enforcement forensic reports, Zimmerman had a broken nose, 2 black eyes, and lacerations to the back of his head. He also had grass stains on his back. And the forensic trajectory of the bullet confirmed that Zimmerman was on the ground on his back when Trayvon Martin was on top of him when the shot was fired. But the media ignored the complexities of the stand your ground law and the reality of a fight that turned into a life or death struggle. They didn't want a story about a botched neighborhood watch encounter. They wanted the story of a racist hunter. And we can't forget that the prosecution's star witness, Rachel Gentile, she was the voice of the Trayvon's final moments. She was the one that was supposed to seal the deal. But when she took the stand, the script fell apart. Under cross-examination, Gentile admitted to lying about why she didn't attend Trayvon's funeral. She gave testimony that was riddled with contradictions compared to her initial statements to the family's attorneys. And according to trial transcripts, she even admitted that she couldn't read the letter that she supposedly wrote about the events of that night. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of a narrative rather than facts. And when the facts didn't show up, the case collapsed. So whether you agree with the not guilty verdict or not, we have to look at what the media did. They took a tragedy. They took a loss of a young man's life. And instead of reporting the facts, they chose to ignite a racial powder keg for ratings. They had the President of the United States, Obama, defending Trayvon. The media edited Zimmerman's 911 call to make him sound like he was a racial profiler. They hid the photos of his injuries. They manufactured a scene that led to years of unrest, all while their stocks prices went up and all of their expert talking heads got book deals. This is what was the fallout. This is what happens when you manufacture racism. Because the business of racism doesn't care about Trayvon Martin, and it certainly doesn't care about George Zimmerman. It cares about the friction. Because in a strong republic, we're supposed to seek truth. In a broken republic, we just seek a side to stand on, a narrative. So before I close this segment, we've looked at the hoax. We've looked at all the hoaxes and the media scripts, but now we have to look at the business of racism on a corporate scale. We're talking about the 2020 Summer of Love, in quotes, which was more like the summer of protests and burns following the George Floyd death, where the world watched as American cities burned and a 3-letter acronym became the global powerhouse, BLM, which was short for Black Lives Matter. Millions and millions of well-meaning people, Black, white, and everything in between, poured their hearts into, and their wallets into the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. They thought that they were funding reform. They thought that they were funding the moving of the needle towards prosperity for Black people. But while the people were in the streets, the leadership was shopping for real estate. So let's look at the sheer scale of the money that was wasted. In the wake of the 2020 protests, the business of racism hit a record-breaking IPO. According to the BLM Global Network Foundation's Impact Report, the organization raised a staggering $90 million just in 2020 alone. They ended the year with a balance of $60 million in their account. So for a nonprofit, this is an astronomical amount of capital. And in 2022, the tax man came calling. And the IRS Form 990 filing pulled back the velvet curtain on where the social justice money actually went. And it was revealed that the foundation used $6 million in donor funds to purchase a luxury mansion in Southern California. We're talking about a 6,500 square foot mansion with a pool, a bungalow, and parking for over 20 cars. They called it their creator house. A place for Black joy. I guess Black joy for who? Okay. But it was a kept secret from the donors for years. But it gets even more incestuous. The 990 filings showed that BLM wasn't just a movement, but it was also a family payroll. The foundation paid nearly $10 million to companies run by people close to the founder, Patrisse Cullors. This included $970,000 to a firm owned by the father of her child for creative services, $840,000 to a security firm owned by her brother, while mothers in the communities were still struggling to pay for funerals as they used the deaths of their sons to raise money for their causes and their programs and their family members. The leadership was cutting million-dollar checks to their own relatives. This is the part that proves that it was a complete shakedown, because the business of racism works from the top down. And the people at the bottom, the actual activists, they got burned. So by 2022 and 2023, local, smaller BLM chapters across the country started speaking out. The Black Lives Matter grassroots groups actually sued the Global Foundation, alleging that the national leadership was unbelievably out of touch and had misappropriated funds meant for local work. And in their 2022 filing, the foundation admitted that it had lost $8.5 million in value in their investment portfolio in just 1 year. They were playing the stock market with just this money and losing. So as of 2024, multiple local chapters had officially severed ties, claiming that they were left out of the cold without a dime of the $90 million that was raised in 2020 to show for it. This was the ultimate betrayal. The business of racism used the genuine pain of our community as a marketing tool to build a real estate empire in California. They sold us a revolution and they bought themselves a mansion. And this is why we have to be smarter. We cannot build a republic on the foundation of a grift. But to see the faces of the people who claim to be social justice warriors, like Al Sharptons, the Jussie Smolletts, the corporate board members at BLM, and then to realize they weren't building a bridge to the future. They were building a balcony for themselves to look down on everybody else, to all of their supporters. And when we look at the billions of dollars flowing into the business of racism, we have to ask ourselves, if they actually solved the problem, would they still have a job? So when we come back in our final segment, we're going to shut the door of the lies and we're going to open the book of truth. We're going to talk about the real estate of race in America, the data the media won't show you, the path to prosperity that doesn't require race-baiting consultants or donations that would go to a California mansion. We're almost finished. You're listening to the Janelle King Show right here on Extra 106.3. Don't leave the table.
Republican Kelvin King is running for Secretary of State to end corruption. Kelvin believes the Secretary of State must be our last line of defense against corruption in our elections. But candidate Gabriel Sterling grabbed a massive no-bid sweetheart deal for himself. He took nearly $250,000 a year of your hard-earned tax dollars with no other bidders. A feeding trough for insiders. Kelvin King will stop Sterling's no-bid deals. It's your money.
Welcome back to the final segment of the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3. And this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings, but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. And if you're just joining us, you've missed a heavy one. We've been exposing the business of racism. That is our table topic, the business of racism. From the $700 million poverty palace to the Southern Poverty Law Center to the scripted hoaxes of Jussie Smollett and Al Sharpton, landing with the real estate empire built by the BLM Global Foundation, we've looked at how The media and professional race baiters use the Albany strategy, creating a scene of violence to drive donations while ignoring the facts to drive emotions. But now, if you want to see the receipts for everything we've discussed, or if you're just tuning in for the first time and you want the full experience, you can watch the video version on YouTube immediately following this radio show, or you can catch an encore episode this Sunday at 9 a.m. right here on Extra 106.3, or you can find us on the Podcast Park or wherever you get your podcast every Tuesday. Now, how do you protect your mind from these professional dividers? You have to learn how to spot the grift. The first sign is the closed loop. If an organization tells you that looking at all sides of the argument is dangerous or traitor or treacherous, then they're manipulating you. Because a strong argument doesn't fear the truth, it welcomes it. To be a truly informed citizen, you must actively collect as much data as you can, even if it's coming from people you disagree with. And if you are then shamed for doing this, then that's a problem. You know, the legendary Thomas Sowell, the great economist, famously put it that racism is not dead, but it is certainly on life support, kept alive mainly by people who use it for an excuse to keep the minority community fearful and resentful of their own political purpose. Think about that. These grifters are the ones holding the paddles, trying to jumpstart a heart that the rest of the country is trying to let heal. They need the Republic to stay sick so that they can keep selling the medicine, knowing there isn't a policy in the world that can legislate a person's heart. So I want to give you my theory on why these race hustlers refuse to let racism die. It's a hard truth, but it needs to be said. I personally believe that it is rooted in inferiority complex. I believe that there is a deep-seated fear among these leaders, these activists, and unfortunately some of the people who follow them, to compete on the same level as everyone else. It's a lack of fundamental confidence. If you remove the crutch of the racial advantage, the idea that you deserve some type of special pass or a bar lowered because of your skin color, then you actually now have to put in the work. You have to be the best. You have to win based on grit, strategy, and excellence. And for many of these hustlers, it is much safer to live in an echo chamber of victimhood than to step out into the open market of meritocracy. It's easier to blame systemic structures for our failures than to admit that you just didn't put in the hours to win. The crutch has become their throne. They've become so comfortable being handicapped by history that they are terrified of a world where they have to stand on their own. They are protecting the racism narrative because they aren't sure if they have the character to win without it. But friends, let me tell you, that's not the spirit of the people I know. It's not the spirit of many of the Black conservatives that I know. We are the descendants of overcomers. We don't need a middleman to negotiate our worth, and we certainly don't need to pay a victimhood tax to a nonprofit in California. A strong republic requires citizens who believe in their own power, who believe that they belong no matter how it started, who refuse to allow grifts and schemes to be the narrative of our community. It requires us to stop being the inventory of someone else's business model. Until next time, stay unafraid, stay unapologetic, and never stop seeking the truth.